Greetings, booktubers, and welcome back to Grammaticus Books. Welcome back to an edition where we're going to be talking about The Ship of Ishtar by A. Merritt, that is Abraham Merritt, originally published in 1924 in serialized form in the pulp magazines. But before we get to The Ship of Ishtar, I have to address the elephant in the room. The black hoodie is gone. It is just too hot up here in the upstairs where I shoot these videos in order to wear the black hoodie anymore. I think it's gone until the weather changes. Probably in September or October, back to something cooler. I think it's going to be t-shirts from here on out for a while. So that is just a little bit of channel news on the black hoodie. But The Ship of Ishtar, Abraham Merritt, 1924 pulp magazines, a fantasy novel about Kenton, John Kenton, a archaeologist. This book here was given to me by Neal, a viewer of the channel. He sent this with a couple of other books. Thank you very, very much, Neal. As soon as I got this book from Neal, I knew it was going to go straight to the top of my TBR list. It did, and I just finished reading it yesterday, and it's wonderful. This Avon edition here of The Ship of Ishtar, there is no publication date listed in this book, only the copyright dates of 1924 and then another copyright date in 1926. However, with some help of some of the viewers on the channel, I think we've identified it as probably being published somewhere in the mid-1950s. It's 35 cents from Avon Publishing. But The Ship of Ishtar, written by Abraham Merritt. Abraham Merritt was actually a journalist working in the United States in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. He was one of the most prominent journalists in the United States. He made a very good living as a journalist. But on the side, he also wrote books. He wrote 8 full-length novels, along with several short stories that he got published as well. And this is the third of his novels. And it's a very good one. Also, one other thing about Abraham Merritt, apparently he was an exceptionally eccentric individual. We're talking very odd guy, which seems to be the case with quite a few of the authors over here in science fiction and fantasy, that they, I don't know, the intelligence level sort of overwhelmed their common sense perhaps. And A. Merritt was no exception. But The Ship of Ishtar, I'll go ahead and I'll read you guys the back blurb of it to give you a little basics about the book and the plot. And there will be some spoilers going forward. No major spoilers, but I would classify them as probably something a little bit beyond minor spoilers. So you've been warned. So the back of the book. An ancient hypnotic enticement reaches out from the past to plunge John Kenton, our hero, into a bygone world of unearthly temptations and unfathomable marvels. An unusual story so real and interesting as to carry the reader well along through all its strange and fantastic episodes. And fantastic episodes is a really good description of this. It is very episodic, again, because it was published in serialized form, but it is very episodic in nature. But there is, it does hold together as a novel, even though it was written in that serialized manner. It still very much holds up and holds together as a novel in a novel form. And the basic plot is that John Kenton has financed this expedition to Babylon. And as part of this expedition, they then ship back to him in New York City a stone box. And inside of the stone box is this fantastically, wonderfully carved model ship. And as he leans over the ship casts a spell on him, and then he is transported onto the deck of the ship, which is, of course, the Ship of Ishtar. And the Ship of Ishtar has been sailing for 6,000 years. It is a cursed ship that is sailing eternally on the seas around the time of Babylon. But for them, time never changes, even though it's been 6,000 years that they've been going on this ship. And the ship is divided exactly into two, with Ishtar running the front half of the ship, which is all in white and manned by the priestesses of Ishtar, and the back half of the ship, which is all in black and is manned by the priests of the god Nergal. And these two forces, there is a magical barrier directly in the middle of the ship, right where the mast is, and they cannot cross this barrier. And they've been at war trying to gain control of the ship for 6,000 years, since the time of Sargon of Akkad. Now, there's a problem with that timeline. That's the timeline that Abraham Merritt puts into the book, but it's not 6,000 years ago to Sargon of Akkad. It's more like 4,300, but we're going to give A. Merritt a pass on that one. So when John Kenton arrives on the ship, since he is neither a priestess of Ishtar nor a priest of Nergal, he is able to cross the barrier and then immediately becomes a pawn in this power struggle to break this eternal deadlock that these two forces have been fighting over for 6,000 years. And that is, in a nutshell, the plot of the story. While he's on the ship, John Kenton makes a number of friends. He makes a friend with Gigi, the drummer, who drums out the beat for the strokes of the galley slaves, who's this deformed drummer. You have Zubran, a prince of Persia, a warrior prince of Persia, and then Sigurd, a Viking, who's been captured and enslaved as a galley slave as well, along with John Kenton. And the story moves forward where he befriends these people, and then they have to work their way through this conflict between these two gods, this goddess and this god Ishtar and Nergal. And it's a very good story. And of course, there's a love interest in it. You've got to throw a love interest into a fantasy novel. And one of the priestesses of Ishtar, Shireen, becomes the love interest of John Kenton. And it is, in effect, a fantasy love story. Now, there are some unusual elements to this book. Abraham Merritt takes a very non-typical moral stance here, particularly when it comes to the galley slaves. So John Kenton winds up as a galley slave during the first part of the book. And when he breaks free, he does not take that opportunity to free the galley slaves. No. There's no freedom for the galley slaves with John Kenton. And in fact, as the galley slaves get killed off during these battles and these adventures that they have, John Kenton actively goes out and enslaves more people, more human beings, in order to chain them to the oars to continue slaving as galley slaves rowing the ship. So that's very unusual. There's no apologies for it. There's no explanation for it. It's just the way of the world back in 6,000 years ago. And A. Merritt just rolls with it full force and doesn't apologize at all. So that's kind of an unusual part of this story. The other kind of unusual part to it is the prose. The prose is a little archaic. It tends into a little bit of purple prose every now and then, but it's not bad. And the writing's exceptionally well. I mean, there's a reason that this book has survived and is still being printed almost 100 years later, because it is very well written. The prose, the style of the prose, and the themes of the book, the plot of the book, the characters in the book remind me greatly of Elric of Melniboné and Michael Moorcock. In fact, I think if you were to swap out some of the names and insert Elric for John Kenton, you would have an absolute Elric story that if you put this and wrote it down with those names swapped, nobody would be able to tell the difference between this as a genuine Elric story by Michael Moorcock or John Kenton here in The Ship of Ishtar by Abraham Merritt. They're that close in style. And obviously this story was written long before Michael Moorcock was doing his Elric stories. So I think it was a heavy influence upon Michael Moorcock when he was writing Elric. The other thing is that there is a major theme that runs through the story, and that's the theme of dualism. So you have the ship that is divided into two. It's white in the front half, it's black in the back half. You have the goddess Ishtar in the front, who is the goddess of life and love. You have the god Nergal in the back, who is the god of death and pestilence. You have all women crewing the front of the ship, and you have all men in the back of the ship. You also have John Kenton, who is drawn back and forth between his modern life and his modern world of New York City in the 1920s, in this ancient world on these sorcerous seas back in 6,000 years ago in the time of Sargon of Akkad. So you've got that duality, and then you also have the ship, which is a puppet ship, a model ship, and a real ship upon the seas, and they're joined magically together. And so those two ships, the model of the ship and the real ship, are actually linked as well. And these are all these themes of two and dualism that ride through the book. And it is essentially sort of, in my opinion, an allegory for life and death and men and women, and the forces that drive people forward in the themes of their lives, the conflict between these two forces that drive forward all of our lives from beginning to end. And I think that's really what A. Merritt was going for with this book, as well as just a great swashbuckling adventure fantasy with a ton of sorcery thrown into it. The other thing that was interesting was the ending of the book. The ending of the book is very atypical, and it's an atypical book, so you would expect an atypical ending. I won't give it away, but it is not your usual ending to a fantasy novel. So I do encourage you to read it. I think because it's on 1924, I think it might be available online, but I'm not sure about that. But it's a very good book. I do encourage you guys to read it. The other thing that I found very interesting about this book is its use of all this ancient mythology and how these ancient gods and demons and entities that are inside of this book here by A. Merritt in the 1900s, early 1900s, have continued and perpetuated even on to today in 2024, as well as, back thousands of years, that these mythological entities were alive and being told in tales thousands of years ago. A. Merritt is still writing about them in the early 1900s, and we are still reinventing them, but keeping them in the same vein here in the year 2024. And I'll give you some examples. Tiamat, the dragon, is listed in here, is written about in here from Dungeons and Dragons. You have the gods Bel and Ishtar, which Robert E. Howard used heavily in his Conan the Hyborian Age stories. And you also have, in addition to that, a Nurgle and a Baden, who are two entities that are used very heavily in the game Warhammer, and their theme and their backstories that they have for their game, Warhammer 40,000, and the original Warhammer as well. So I really thought that was an interesting tie-in about how these ancient myths and these ancient gods and demons have existed through history, and they keep getting written about, and they're definitely very prominent in the book here, the Ship of Ishtar, and they are not just in the background. They come forward and take an active role here in the book. But that's it. That's the Ship of Ishtar. In conclusion, if I was going to give this book an overall rating, I would give it a solid 8 out of 10. It's a very good book. It's a very great fantasy book. And again, this was sent to me by Neal. Thank you very much, Neal. I really appreciated it. This was a great read. I had a blast with it. And so that's it. The Ship of Ishtar coming in at 8 out of 10. And this is Grammaticus saying take care, be safe, and I'll catch you guys next time.